Since the prequels and the Old Republic era of Star Wars, a question that is subject to endless fascination is whether or not Jedis are allowed to have sex. And I figured that basically every Star Wars YouTuber out there has covered this topic at some point, I might do so as well.
You freed me from an inconvenient husband and put me in control of this house. Let me show you my appreciation. In private.
Whoa! Wait a minute. You're not seriously considering this.
Keep your opinions to yourself.
And I promise you that if you stick around to the end of the video, you will get a definitive answer as to whether or not Jedis can have sex. But before the video begins, consider subscribing to the channel for all things Star Wars. I make sure to cover all the latest upcoming Star Wars projects in terms of lore, speculation, and news. And so, if these are the topics that are right up your alley, consider joining the community by subscribing. So, are Jedis allowed to have sex? In order to understand this part, you must understand the philosophy of the Jedi Order. I did a video on this some time ago. So, if you're unfamiliar with how the philosophy of the Jedi Order works, consider checking out the link on the top right. But in summary, part of the Jedi philosophy is the need to relinquish any worldly desires, so that a Jedi can pursue greater causes for the good of the galaxy, which means that attachments in particular are discouraged from the Jedi Order as they are considered to be part of worldly desires. But how does this relate to sex? Well, of course, no attachment is necessary for a Jedi to have sex, and we see this in Ki-Adi-Mundi, who has several wives due to the declining population of his species. Given that men of his species were rare, it was necessary for the Jedi Master to procreate with other of his own species in order to ensure its survival. But Ki-Adi-Mundi was also known to be incredibly distant from his wives and children. In fact, the Jedi Master made little effort to establish a relationship with his wives and children, and only showed up when it was necessary. So it would seem that yes, Jedis are allowed to have sex provided if there are no attachments involved. But that being said, Ki-Adi-Mundi was definitely a special case. The Jedi Master had to engage in sexual activity in order to ensure the survival of his species. Not every Jedi could manage this sort of impersonal relationship with those that they slept with. Instead, for many other species, sexual activity is part of bonding with their partners and not necessarily solely about procreation.
Uh-oh. Your powers are weak, old man. Obi-Wan!
Boy, you got here just in time.
Additionally, the urge to engage in sexual activity is also taught to be part of worldly desires, and should therefore not be indulged by the Jedi. It can also be argued that a Jedi could develop attachments as a result of sexual activity, and so, to avoid any chance of this happening, Jedi should avoid sex altogether. So what is it? Are Jedis allowed to have sex or not? The truthful answer is, it depends. You see, depending on which era of the Jedi Order you are referring to, there can be some widely differing answers. During the prequel era, where the Jedi Order's interpretation of the Jedi philosophy was far more dogmatic and rigid, the simple answer would be no. On the most part, Jedis were not allowed to have sex for fear that it could lead them down towards the dark side. Now, of course, there were exceptions such as Ki-Adi-Mundi, but on the whole, any sort of sexual activity was strictly prohibited, as it was necessary for the Jedis to completely forgo any worldly desires. But that being said, if you were to look at the era of the High Republic, the answer would change slightly. In fact, in the book The Light of the Jedi, it is stated that a Jedi wanted to marry another Jedi as they believed it would strengthen their connection to the Force. While the particular Jedi was eventually dissuaded by her peers, it is clear that the interpretation of the Jedi philosophy was less dogmatic. Instead, it is quite clear that during the era of the High Republic, the rules were a lot more relaxed as to whether or not Jedis could engage in sexual activity and form attachments that would have been otherwise disallowed during the prequel era. However, it also depends on which Jedi you are talking to. While during the High Republic era, the rules were a lot more relaxed, certain Jedis would pursue a much more rigid interpretation of the Jedi philosophy. Jedi Council member Jorah Mali puts forward the argument that there is a difference between the celibacy of the body and the purity of the heart, which means that for some Jedi, it is not enough to simply abstain from sexual activity, but it is also required for one to be free from any thought of it. And so, depending on the interpretation of the individual, Jedi sex can either be prohibited or not. Not all Jedis interpreted attachments to be a bad thing. Take a look at Kanan Jarrus and his relationship with Hera Syndulla. It is quite clear that both of them have a strong attachment with each other, but from Kanan's perspective, it is not a given that attachments lead to the dark side, but rather it is the possessive attachments that can lead to the dark side of the Force. We also see this very clearly in the Legends continuity. The relationship between Luke Skywalker and Mara Jade clearly shows that this is possible for a Jedi to have sexual relationships with another Jedi, and that it was not necessarily a fast track towards the dark side, which means that based on this interpretation, sex is allowed. While it feels as though we have a multitude of answers as to whether or not Jedis are allowed to have sex, we can clearly see that it depends on the individual interpretation and which era of the Jedi Order you are referring to. So the answer is, it depends on how you want to interpret the Jedi philosophy. However, there is a case to be made that the more moderate understanding of the Jedi philosophy is the correct way of interpretation. And so, yes, Jedis are allowed to have sex, and there is good reason to believe that this is the more accurate representation of the Jedi philosophy, given that George Lucas himself did say that Jedis are not celibate. So, what do you think? Should Jedis be allowed to engage in sexual activity? Let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. I am the Lost Acolyte,
and I have spoken.